up here that does not yet have a paper? All right, I'm going to ask everybody that is able and willing, I'm going to see if you'll move up. If you're already in a pretty full row, you guys can stay, but like there's 5 or 6 seats, 7 seats in the front row. For those sitting all the way in the back, there's a few seats in the next row. Love to have people be a little closer if possible. All right. Real quick, as we're getting started, I'm going to let you guys talk to someone you don't know really quickly. Maybe interact with someone, meet someone new. I have some more papers being printed, so if you don't have one, you will get one shortly. Just waiting on those. I'm going to send around the attendance book. If it's your first time to life groups at LBC, there is a green card in the front. Please do that. If it's just your first time in here, just write your name down right here and make sure we have record of you being here. Thank you. But yeah, talk, gab with one another, meet someone new. And who does not yet have a paper at all? Hey, Jackie, I'm about to walk out of the room for a second. Perfect. All right, anyone who does not have a paper, there may be a couple. I see 1, 2, 3, and then John, you'll need one. Tyler is bringing me papers. As soon as he gets in, I'll have you raise your hand again. He'll walk over and hand you one. For the time being, we'll go ahead and get moving. I only get until 10:48. After that, I start getting in trouble, so I'm trying to finish before then. But that said, we are moving in today. So if you have been with us thus far, we are on week 9. If you've not, that's okay. We're just jumping in. We'll be in Genesis 47 today. For those that are new to our group, we ask that you read whatever chapter we're on that week. So you should have read Genesis 47 this week. And If you didn't, I don't know about it because I wasn't there with you. But I hope you did. Next week, we're doing 2 chapters. That'll be one of the few times we have to do this. It'll be 48 and 49. So make sure you read both of those for next week. It'll help you. And if you see something that confuses you, or you're like, why in the world is that there? It's a great time to look it up. And then maybe you have something to add to the conversation next week. All right. So I was with children for far too long, so I put pictures on all my lessons. So only a couple, though. In the top left and right, I have a couple pictures. The lesson for Lesson 9 is called Food for Now, Hope for the Future, which is why there's bread and a skeleton who seems to be praying. It was an interesting skeleton, so I picked him. So today, we're going to see God's blessing upon his people and Pharaoh for his future promises. That's promises and purposes. That's what God is doing here. In the introduction, we need to know that there are times of great blessing that people go through, but most of the time they start with trouble. Most of the time before a time of great blessing, you've gone through a great distress, or maybe even right after. But what's important when you're going through those times is, what is your character? Who are you when those things are going on? That's what's going to make all the difference in the world, both in the valleys as well as the mountaintops. We must think less about what to do and more about what to be. Who does God have you to be? Today, as we move through the lesson, we see a trusted leader make great strides forward for his family and business because he was faithful the whole way through. So as we hop into Genesis 47 today, the first thing I want you to see is there's going to be an audience before Pharaoh. There's going to be an audience before Pharaoh. So Joseph's brethren are the first ones that get to see Pharaoh. So this is Genesis 47. If you're here with us, I ask people to read a lot. So if you would be comfortable reading and reading loud, because we've got a bunch of people today, if somebody read verse 1 out loud for us. Rita? All right, thank you. Will you read verse 2 for us, brother? I will in just a minute. Tyler's got them for me. He's bringing them up. Yes, sir. Verse 2 there. Yep. Real quick, before he reads that, if you don't have a paper, Tyler's going around right now. Raise your hand. Great job. Thank you, sir. Verse 3. Go ahead, Sam. Yeah, he said, what's your occupation? He said, we're shepherds. Verse 4. Dustin, you want to read it? All right, so as we're walking through this, we're going to see a couple things. We're going to see that these men, the brethren of Joseph, obeyed what their brother told them to do. They were honest about their profession. Now, it's not like he told them to do anything crazy. He just said, hey, tell Pharaoh you're a shepherd. Now, if you were here in previous weeks, why does that matter? The shepherds were an abomination unto the Egyptians. And so they probably didn't want them among all the people. So it worked nice to have the Israelites in their own area, in their own group, and it helped them not to intermix quite as much as they're going to be leaving later. So they make a request of Pharaoh in respect to their needs. This is a good thing to do. If you know you have specific needs of things, to go to someone who has the power to change it and say, hey, can you please help us with this, is a great thing. Because one, most people don't realize the need you have unless you say something about it, and they don't know what you do. So they didn't know they were shepherds until it was put forth. So they requested at Joseph's direction the land of Goshen. You can see this actually in chapter 46 if you went back. He goes through and he says, hey, this land of Goshen is the place that you guys want to be. Understand, he's already been there for several years. At this point, he will have been there for at least 20, 22 years. I mean, it's been some time. And so he's going through and he's saying, look, you want to be right here because obviously this is the place where there'd be food for the animals. This is the place where there would be good area for the people. And he knew this was going to be the perfect place for the Israelites. So that's what you have with Joseph's brethren talking to Pharaoh. So the second thing we see is Pharaoh's proclamation upon the family. This comes in Genesis 47, verses 5 and 6. Somebody read verse 5 for us. All right, and then I saw, Bob, do you have your hand up for verse 6? Go ahead. Yep, he said, if you know any men of activity among them, make them head over my cattle as well. So Pharaoh is happy to oblige, but notice who he answers. Did he answer the brethren? No. He responds to Joseph. Now, Joseph is somebody who would have had good opportunity. He would have had a good relationship with the Pharaoh. And so it makes sense that the Pharaoh would talk directly to him. That said, it's often not about what you know, but instead of who you know. Imagine if these shepherds came to Pharaoh, but didn't have Joseph in the place as second in command. Why would he be obliged to take care of them? He wouldn't. Remember, shepherds are an abomination under the Egyptians. Shepherds are not someone, in general, the Egyptians would have liked. So you see God's providence in moving Joseph into this area of second in command to save his family from this situation. Now, Pharaoh also suggested having one of his brothers maintain all of Pharaoh's cattle if they were men of activity. What do you guys think that means, men of activity? They knew what they were doing. Anybody else? Men of activity. Say it louder. Go-getters, people that are willing. Yeah, I think that's a good way. The idea of the word actually means men of great ability or efficiency. There's something to be said about someone who can do their job and do it well. There's a good verse for this in Proverbs 22. Proverbs 22:29 says, seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. He shall not stand before mean men. The idea there is the average person. If he's really, really good, he's going to get used by higher status people. It's not just the everyday person that can afford him, but he's over the top. He is the next level. And so that's kind of what Pharaoh's saying, is if you know someone who's really good, which is interesting that he says that because he hasn't seen his brethren except for recently in 22 years. Like, if you know someone who's really talented, have that guy help. Well, maybe he does. Maybe beforehand he saw, the leadership abilities of Judah. If you've followed the last few chapters with us, Judah has been kind of the guy who's taken the lead. Reuben tried a couple times, but Reuben's not a great leader. He actually offered to slay his own sons in order to convince his dad to be the surety for Benjamin, which, why would that make sense? The guy who's sad about losing a child, why would he want to kill his grandchildren? But instead, you see Judah, who's gone through the loss of children, who can come and say, let me be a surety for my brother. Let me come and stand in the gap for this. So you see, maybe Judah would be the person for this. You know, you have some great shepherds that come out of the line of Judah. Couple. Number 3 there, we see Jacob is introduced to Pharaoh. Genesis 47:7. Somebody read it for us. Sorry, I thought your hand was up. Go ahead, Faith. And if you heard none of that, because I coughed, Joseph brought Jacob, his father, to set before Pharaoh. And it says, Jacob blessed Pharaoh. That's really interesting. We'll get into that in a little bit. Verse 8. Somebody. That's something you want to ask as you meet somebody. How old are you? Well, maybe not. All right. But obviously, he was someone who had some age, some wisdom. He's coming down and pronouncing a blessing on another person. He seemed to have something to bestow. Verse 9. Go ahead. Yeah, I never would have thought someone 130 years old would have been like, I haven't lived very long. My life has been difficult and short at 130 years in. Verse 10 says, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. Now, I think it's worthy to note that Jacob is the one that blessed Pharaoh, not the other way around. You know, Pharaoh probably could have had a lot of nice things to say to Jacob, who raised, you know, the kid who pretty much saved all of Egypt and the surrounding countries. But it's Jacob who comes in and gives the blessing. This would be because any increase would then be seen as it was God's providence on God's people giving it to Pharaoh, and not Pharaoh as the God-man pronouncing some blessing on God's people. God was going to get the credit for what happened here. Is also a large point made in the New Testament regarding Melchizedek and Abraham. Yes, there's a Hebrews reference. Hebrews 7:7, it says, and without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. So if you're not familiar with what it's referencing in the Old Testament, Abraham, who was God's chosen man for God's chosen people, had just gone out and he had whooped some different kings that had stolen his nephew. And so him and some of his trained soldiers went out. They got the captives back. They got everything that was taken from the people in Sodom, which is where his nephew was. Bad idea. And what he does is, on his way back in, he is stopped by this great priest king named Melchizedek. And Melchizedek blesses Abraham. And that showed that Melchizedek, on some level, was greater than Abraham, because the less is blessed of the better. And so you see the same thing here. So Pharaoh may be Pharaoh in Egypt, but he's not as good as Jacob is. Jacob is God's man. Something to note. Jacob, therefore, is seen as the greater person, as we said. Pharaoh sought after Jacob's age, which was 130. It must have been obvious that he had lived a significant amount of time. Jacob noted that the years of his life had been difficult and less than his previous generations. So, what caused the difficulty for Jacob? He did. That's a good answer. What's his name mean? Trickster, deceiver. You know what caused most of his headaches in life? Dishonesty. Deception, whether on his part or someone else's towards him. Think about the things that have gone through in his life. We'll go through it. He stole his brother's birthright. Now, you may say he didn't steal it, he bargained for it. Look, if you take a person who thinks they're about to die and you say, I'll give you this if you give me this, they're going to take it. Now, maybe his brother was being dramatic, I don't know. But the point is, the birthright shouldn't have been his on paper. And so he felt like it had been taken from him, and he hated his birthright. Esau did from that point on. He also stole his brother's blessing. Now, this was at the request of his mother. his mother said, you need to go in and pretend to be Esau and then go get the blessing. And that was a bad idea because it caused hatred from Esau. Esau was ready to kill Jacob. And so his mom got him out of there by sending him to her family, where he could go get a wife. Now, they married cousins in that age. Don't talk to me about that. It was weird. I know it's weird. But they did. And so he would have married his first cousin, or second cousin, somewhere in there, somebody's cousin. He married someone. But on the way to that, he was promised a girl. She was pretty. Anybody know her name? Rachel. And he went through the ceremony, and he got to the end of it, and he woke up in the morning, and lo and behold, who's in his bed? Leah. Now, don't ask me how he didn't know that before then. I don't know the answer to that. I was going to say a lot of wine or a very thick veil. I'm not really sure what happened there. But what I do know is he woke up and was like, you're not Rachel. So what did he do? He worked for another 7 years for Rachel. Now, some people believe he actually married her right after the marriage week was over and then worked the 7 years following for her. I don't know the answer to that, potentially. But the idea is he got tricked. And that makes sense after just tricking his brother twice. Oh, and guess what? He gets tricked again, because after he does this, he doesn't get to leave. He now has to work another 7 years for cattle, for sustenance, for a way to be okay when he leaves. And so you see him not getting what he's looking for. And he makes the statement, he's like, my wages have been changed by you so many times already. And so deception has caused him a lot of headache, a lot of heartache. And finally, you see the deception playing in as being lied to about his son's death. The sons had tricked their father and said, hey, your son, this is his jacket, it's tore up seemingly by a beast. We don't know what happened. And they just let their dad believe whatever story he came up with in his head. That's a lie, by the way. They were deceiving him. Yeah. Well, you can see this, but think about it. He's talking about all the difficulty and the pain in his life, and so much of it came from being deceptive. How important a lesson is that we need to be honest people. Next, we see the consolidation of the nation under Pharaoh. This takes up a good chunk of the chapter, if you're familiar, if you read it with us this week. And it comes in a few parts. But the first thing we're going to see is the Israelites are in Goshen with bread. There's a famine in the land, and these guys have bread. They seem to be pretty well taken care of. Verses 11 and 12. Somebody read 11. Somebody read 12. Really pays who you know. Now, this land is called the land of Ramses, but it's also been referenced several times as Goshen. Just so you know, this is often the reason that it is thought that they would have exited at the time of Ramses II in history. That would put the Exodus around the 1200s. The problem with that is it doesn't match up with the other dates that we know in the Bible. Like, we know when the temple was consecrated. It would have been, I think, around like 966 BC. And we know that 480 years before that is the time frame that you would have for the Exodus. So that really adds up more like to the 1400s. But people see the word Ramses in there and they're like, oh, it had to be at the time of Ramses II. But see, it didn't. It could be an anachronistic way of writing in a place so that the common reader at a certain time would know, oh, that's what Goshen is. Goshen is the land of Ramses. And so I would just be very careful with that. If you watch like the Discovery Channel, they're going to be like, there's no evidence of Exodus in the 1200s, because it didn't happen in the 1200s. It happened in the 1400s. There is some evidence to that and things like that. So there's just important things to know there. Now, we also know that in general, the herds and people were in the land of Goshen. Now, if you're not familiar, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible? Moses did. So understand, he's writing them knowing everything that's happened since then. So occasionally, earlier in the Bible, you'll get notes about things that people shouldn't have known because he's writing from behind back, if that makes sense. It's a historical thing. So Genesis 13:10, I bet a lot of people didn't even pick this up when they read it, but let somebody read 13:10 for us. Okay, so if you look it up, the referencing place they're talking about is Goshen. So that compares the plain of Jordan and Eden, the garden of the Lord, to be like this place that they are going to be. And the idea here isn't that, it has the same thing, so there's not like an extra tree of knowledge of good and evil in this place. But the problem, or the good thing they have, is they have an immense amount of water. It is a place where you could easily get a lot of farming. You could have pasture for your animals. It's a place where you could easily have animals get water, which is an important thing. Think about it, in this time frame, they didn't have all of the things we have now. They needed to be positioned near the water. They needed to be in places where they could get and take care of people effectively. And this area specifically is well watered. What? It was also in the time of a drought, you're right. But you have to understand that Joseph saw this place before the drought. So he would have had an understanding of what place was good. He also knew when the drought was going to be over. So remember, he directed them to Goshen because he knew that would be the place they could be. All right, where are we at? The Israelites had bread. Let's look at what everybody else had. Genesis 47:13. Okay, so keep in mind, in this time, Joseph is making sure specifically his family is taken care of. Now, he is taking care of everybody else too, but not to the same degree. He feels he has more of a responsibility to them. He's making sure they have bread, they have what they need, their cattle are fed, they're watered, whatever. But everybody else, you can see there is a struggle in the land. In general, the people had nothing to eat, so in 3 steps, they begin trading everything away to Pharaoh. As we saw with Esau, you'll get rid of a bunch of stuff if you're hungry. You can talk people into things if they're hungry and you're offering them food. So the first thing everybody gives, this is pretty standard, they gave their money. They would give their gold. They would give the things they had. Somebody read verse 14. "15 says, and when the money failed in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came into Joseph and said, give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? The money faileth." So I don't know if this became an intense form of inflation, where there was a lot of money and not a lot of product, so the price has gone up. I don't know if this was just they ran out of money and they're saying, we don't have anything to give you. Let's figure something else out. Why should we die? That doesn't make sense. Let's figure something else out that we can trade. Hey, bartering's not a bad system. Verse 16, they gave their cattle. Who wants to read 16? All right, he said, if you really want to, you can give me your cattle. Whatever. Verse 17. Go ahead, Sam. Yeah, so he fed them that whole year for their cattle. But who did Pharaoh say could be in charge of the cattle? One of Joseph's brothers, if they were in their activity. So understand, the whole time, things are being given. Joseph is being made more rich because the people are giving money, and I'm sure the Pharaoh's giving him a cut of money. The cattle are coming in. I'm sure on some level he's probably receiving some cattle out of this because you've got to pay Joseph still somehow, and there's not money coming in anymore. All right, so that leads us to the final section. They began to sell their lands and even themselves into the service of Pharaoh. Verse 18 through 20, that happens, and we're only going to read 19 and 20. I'm going to read 19 and then have somebody else ready to read 20. It says, "Wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants unto Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, and the land be not desolate." Somebody read verse 20. So everybody sold their land. This is a huge consolidation of power for the Pharaoh. It's really incredible. He now has pretty much all the money. He's got all the cattle. He owns all the land. And now the people are going to be selling themselves essentially to him as a workforce, as labor, in order to get food. So think about what just happened. You've got the Israelites who've come in. They're outsiders. They have bread while nobody else does. They're multiplying. They have more money coming in. They have more cattle coming in. And then you've got the people of Egypt who are sitting there, and they're at the point where they're selling themselves. It's not a surprise when there finally became a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph that he said, these people are too powerful. We need to get rid of them. We need to knock them down a peg. Because what you have here is you have Joseph, who has essentially amassed all the power for Pharaoh and his family. And they're not even Egyptians. Now, there were some people who didn't have to sell their land. I didn't have time or place to put all this in here. Specifically, the religious people. Just like in the Bible, the tribe of Levi, you know how they didn't necessarily get their own places, but they had cities that were theirs? They had things that were always given to them, like bread. They had the showbread and things they could eat. They could eat of the altar. Well, that was kind of the same for Pharaoh. Pharaoh's religious leaders continually had land. They continually had food because Pharaoh made that happen. So it's kind of cool some of the pictures you've seen between what happens in Egypt and what happens in the wilderness, sometimes with the people. There sometimes is quite a bit of overlap. But anyway, some people may dislike the idea of Joseph's consolidation of Egypt for Pharaoh. But if you read the passage, the people are not upset. They are thankful for their lives. They are thankful for the opportunity to have food when they would have had no other way to have food. They feel like Joseph is a very good benefactor, that he's caring for the people as much as is necessary. So this isn't this thing where they're ready to stage like a workers' revolt, like, how dare you? Like, he's the only reason those people survive. I enjoy this quote from Matthew Henry. It said, "The Egyptians confessed concerning Joseph, thou hast saved our lives. What multitudes will gratefully say to Jesus at the last day, thou hast saved our souls from tremendous destruction, and in the season of uttermost distress. The Egyptians parted with all their property and even their liberty for the saving of their lives. Can it then be too much for us to count all but loss and part with all at his command and for his sake? Who will both save our souls and give us 100-fold even here in this present world? Surely, if saved by Christ, we shall be willing to become his servants." And look at that parallel. Joseph is the intermediate between Pharaoh and everyone else. Jesus is the intermediate between us and God the Father. Some people don't like that you have to, there is a loss that happens. I can't keep my self-righteousness and come to Jesus. I can't keep anything. I have to say, Lord, I have nothing. Take me. And that's the picture you get with Joseph. There's a reason he's a type of Christ. The third and the third and final section is the blessings of Israel and the hope of return. So if you continue reading, you'll find out the Israelites have been multiplying. They are doing exceedingly well in Egypt. Genesis 47:27. Somebody read it. Now, it is important to know that time passes. They are not considered still in the famine by the end of this chapter. How many years of famine was there going to be? 7. So when they got there, remember, Jacob was how old? 130. So read the next verse. Go ahead. Okay, so this would have been 10 years past the famine. All the land is procuring seed again. All the things that were so bountiful in the land are finally coming back. And you have to understand, when the people sold themselves, what they were told is, you're going to take 80% of whatever you make for you, give 20% to Pharaoh. It was kind of like not like how you think about indentured servitude in the early part. I mean, they were probably technically slaves in all counts, but it turned into this thing where they still had 80% of their land, so they could take care of themselves. They could care for what they needed, but they just had to give a fifth to Pharaoh. Almost sounds like tax. Anyway. Huh? Or sharecropping. Yeah, I hear you. So, it's interesting. This is 10 years past the famine. So, Jacob does not give up on what God has promised him. He still trusts what's going to happen. If you're not familiar, last week we learned that God came to Jacob in a vision and told him, this is right for you to go. Your son will take care of you. He'll be there when you die. But he also said that God will bring the people out of there eventually. We looked last week at Genesis 15, where God promised that there would be 400 years of exile in another place where they become the servants of another people. And then God will bring them out by a mighty hand. And the reason he did that is because the sin of the Amorites was not yet full. God knew he was going to have to go in and cleanse the Canaanite land. But he waited until they were so exceedingly sinful, nobody could say, how dare you, God? Which is what people still try to do now. But they skipped that portion. God waited 400 years for them to get right. They didn't. So Jacob ends by trusting in God. Genesis 47:29 through 31. Somebody read 29. Okay, so I've said this before and I'll say it again. When I was growing up, we did pinky swears. You have to be really serious to say, stick your hand underneath my thigh to show me you're serious. For a man to stick his hand up under another man's thigh and be like, make this promise with me, this is weird. I mean, I'm not going to do that if I'm not totally serious. I'm just saying. But that's how they would make deals. They'd say, look, this is how serious I am. They'd stick their hand under their thigh. But that's what he said. He said, look, if I've found grace in thine sight, deal kindly with me. Don't bury me in Egypt. I don't want to stay here. This is not the place I'm supposed to be. They knew Their land was where? Canaan. They knew they were going to have an inheritance from the Lord. He is showing faith in God's promise. Verse 30. So he said, "Carry me out of Egypt, bury me with my fathers." So they had bought a plot of land. They had, I believe, a cave on this plot of land where they had been burying the patriarchs. And so they knew exactly where it was. They knew where everybody was at. And they decided they would go bury both Jacob and his beloved before them in this area. So note, this is the first time that you see Jacob bow before his son, as was prophesied. Verse 31. So that means he stuck his hand under his thigh, just in case anyone missed that. But it says he bowed upon his bed's head. So at the very beginning, if you're familiar with the story, in chapter 37, Joseph had two dreams. First dream is that his brothers would bow down to him. They would serve under him, which is really an annoying dream because he's the second youngest child. They're like, "How dare you?" There's a reason why they tried to kill him. We're going to kill him. The second dream he had was not only would the brothers do it, but his parents would. But up until this point, you don't see his parents bow down to him ever. Now, if you're familiar with the story, his mom is long dead. She actually had died giving birth to his brother Benjamin. But it could have been of the woman who raised him, not necessarily his mother. But just to think about, this is the fulfillment of God's promise from 22, 25, no, this is far longer. He came in at 130, it's been 17 years. This is God's promise being fulfilled 39 years ago. We must not get too hesitant to say, "Okay, God, will you do this?" and then wait for him to do it. Sometimes it takes years for God's movement to happen in a way that we can see it. But he's moving the whole time. But sometimes it takes a long time to get our requests put forth. But we need to keep faith in the meantime. In conclusion, as the chapter comes to a close, some of the most important lessons for us to learn is that honesty really is the best policy. It ruined Jacob's life in a lot of ways by being deceitful. God will get you where you need to be, but sometimes at great peril to yourself if you haven't been living appropriately. God was working the whole time. God was sovereign. God was in control. But God also taught Jacob some lessons and wrestled with him all night, which is pretty sick. Sometimes we can be blessed by who we know instead of what we know. And being men of activity is needful today because we never know when it may help change our situations. Remember as well, greater is the man with God than the man with wealth and status. And let's remember how grateful we should be to the one who saved us. We should be like those Egyptians, willing to give our lives in joy to his service. All right, guys, let's pray real quick, and then we'll be out. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for those that were here today. Thank you for many people that hear your word today. God, I pray that we would have a good heart about serving you. I pray we would live lives of character, live worthy of the gospel. God, help us to remember you have done so much more for us than we could ask or think. Help us to learn lessons from people before us instead of having to learn them the hard way ourselves. In your name we pray. Amen. Yes, ma'am. I did not. Just as a reminder, we are